Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our fourth and final plenary session of today is titled Calling for Transformation, a Critical Evaluation from the Majority World, and will be moderated by Professor Samuel Pang, a professor of theology and the director of the Yonsei Institute of African Studies. Professor Pang, thank you for your participation today, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. You have endured for a long time today, so you must be really tired. But I'll make sure that we will finish everything on time. I have heard so much the feeling of this conference. I think there is just some idea of stagnation, frustration, uncertainty. I think we are here to look for alternative way. I mean, as a professor, I was thinking of that. Maybe we need a different syllabus, different curriculum to tackle this uncertainty and stagnation that we are facing right now. Anyway, welcome to this session. It is called the Calling for Transformation, a critical reflection from the majority world. I don't know if you're familiar with the majority world. I think these days people say it's the global south, global north, but actually this is a geographical division. Maybe we mean if it's time to change, it's a majority world or minority world. So that's why I chose the word majority world rather than talking of the global south. This session, we will engage a deep and introspective exploration of the current state of development initiative, particularly from the perspective of the majority world. We will critically reflect on the challenges and opportunity and aspiration of the community often marginalized within the global development discourse. Throughout this discussion, we'll examine whose questions are being posed and whose answers are being prioritized in shaping developing agenda. We will challenge conventional narrative and explore alternative pathways toward transformative change that prioritize equity, justice, and sustainability. Join us as we amplify the voices and the perspective of the majority world and collectively call for a paradigm shift in how we conceptualize and implement development strategy. Let us begin, or let us ignite the conversation that is inspired action and pave the way for the more inclusive, more equitable world. We have two distinguished speakers today. Professor Lanka Bulla, she is a distinguished academic and esteemed leader in the field of education, currently serving as the Vice Chancellor and principal, which means the president in this in Korean context, at the University of South Africa, UNISA. And I have to show that the Professor Lanka Bulla is the first female vice chancellor, the president in the history of South Africa. We have to give her applause. Professor Lanka Bulla will bring a wealth of experience and expertise to the academic community, with a focus of the promoting inclusivity and innovation and excellence in education. Professor Lanka Bulla is dedicated in the shaping the future of higher education and higher learning and advancing societal development. And we have another guest. We are honored to have His Excellency Togorani Idris Mabura, who served as ambassador of Tanzania to the Republic of Korea, our country. Ambassador will bring, he has still extensive experience in diplomacy and international relations to the discussion, offering insight from the perspective of Tanzania or Africa, a developing nation striving towards sustainable development. I'd like to ask the Professor Lanka Bulla, you go first, and then the Excellencies will follow, and then we'll have a discussion. And then if you have enough time, we'll receive the comments and the questions from the floor. Thank you very much. Professor Lanka Bulla.
Thank you, Professor Peng, for the introduction. I must first correct that I'm not the first woman vice chancellor in South Africa. I'm the first woman vice-chancellor for the oldest university in South Africa,
Oh,
the University of South Africa, but also the oldest open distance education institute in the world. So that's the thing. Let me thank you for the introduction and for the theme. I'm truly appreciative to be here in Korea, in Yonsei University, but more importantly, to reflect with you on the notion of on the notion of calling for transformation and a critical evaluation from the majority world. I want to first state that my reflections will stem from the perspective of a feminist ethicist who's an academic leader, who's concerned and committed to ensuring that the world we live in is transformed through education, and that the role of higher education and university systems become important imperatives in rethinking and reformulating the future. Universities by nature are social institutions that create the foundations for knowledge analysis, and therefore, one of the critical assets of university is never to take the set agenda as it is. The first question to ask is whose agenda, who's setting it, what are the value systems, what is the knowledge systems, what are the analytical framework, and whether such agenda is enabling or not enabling for humanity, but also for the ecosystem. So I'm happy that UNISA, the university I represent, and Yonsei University that you see here are such important assets for the global society in addressing the sustainable development goals and whether they really provide meaning-making in the imagination or resetting of the future. I thought I should basically contextualize the question by pointing to the grand questions that our societies are grappling with as they contend with sustainable development gains. Images are quite important because they're reflexive of the questions that humanity asks. The key critical question is images of poverty, one of the first aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. But it's also the questions of distress that we were just talking about in the previous session when we were talking about stress, depression, and sometimes the competitive nature of the lives that humanity lead and that it disabled them from being fully human. Issues of ecological degradation, climatic changes, and thus the woundedness of creation or of the earth as the foundational resource for our lives become a very important grand question for us to raising if we are to analyze the imperative for sustainable development goals and therefore the solutions that we should imagine. The same is true to the context of war, violence, and ammunition, and budgets of societies and nations that are oftentimes invested on wars and not necessarily on the eradication of violence. Sorry, I'm using... Should I go back or? Yes. So I want to be a little bit contextual, controversial, but also invite your imagination. We've been dealing with the Millennium Development Goals, and we couldn't accomplish them when we were discussing developmental aspirations of societies and the global arena. There were 8, sorry. And then we decided, oh, okay, we have failed on the Millennium Development Goals, and therefore we're going to propose Sustainable Development Goals, 17. My colleagues and my students tell me that the Sustainable Development Goals are actually the projections of the failures of humanity to prioritizing the key important imperatives, because we have accepted poverty, we have accepted climatic and non-sustainable development, we have accepted that the budget systems of the wealth of nations must be hoarded by only 40 individuals in the global arena, and the majorities of the people are not living with decency. And so that is a lens that I think is quite important when you think about the majorities, because the majorities represent the youthful dividend of the world, the majority of humanity, particularly located in the global south. The other aspect around the majorities are the economic margins, those who live in the context of poverty, whether they are dependent on rental systems or finances by the states within which they live. It can also be in terms of the ecological degradation and the climatic changes and the impact of those societies that have lost hope precisely because they cannot imagine the future because of the ecological and climatic changes. Those islands around Africa, around the Pacific, or even countries that are constantly bedeviled by ecological challenges. So when we think about the majorities, I think we should think of all those on the underside or who are impacted heavily around these aspects that I've called the grand questions of our time. Then for us as Africans, it's very important that our analysis is not from borrowed knowledge systems, architectures, frameworks around what development is about. Earlier on, we had a colleague from the Netherlands speaking on behalf of Africans, as though Africans don't have analytical tools and framework of determining what are the developmental trajectories that ought to be followed. In this instance, I want to state that Africa, through its Agenda 2063, has identified its own trajectories and development paths, which to a large extent are in concert with the Sustainable Development Goals, but are attentive to the contextual realities and exigencies of Africa, not as a gaze on Africa, but as an active moral agency in changing the world and in imagining and co-constructing the global arena. And these are entailed in Agenda 2063, as I've said, the Africa that Africans imagine, which is attentive to the development goals that are attentive to the resources management on the seas, on the earth, on people, on the goals of humanizing knowledge systems, humanizing relationships between people, but also ecologically centered relationality to people. Here in Korea, you have a concept that you call sangseng that I've learned from some of your scholars around conviviality. These are some of the critical value systems that I think are important in our reflexivity around the relevance of sustainable development goals. So for us, when we think about what might be transformative agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals, is first the ideation, the decolonization of the lenses of analysis, the critical engagement with the resources, the contextualization of the Sustainable Development Goals. They are highly decontextualized and monolithic to the extent that they can not be resources for development if they are not interrogated. The other aspect that we think is quite important for us from a scholarly perspective is that for sustainable development goals to make sense, they need not just talk about these framing of decontextualized aspirations, but must look at the questions that societies in the geopolitical, geospatial, and demographic or aspirations are located in. Each time I press, it looks like it's slow. So for instance, as a case in point for Africa, I said we witness youthful population, deepening inequalities, global monopolies of power that are concentrated in our continent for extractive purposes and for our mineral, biotic, and other resources. The economic gains, which are valued more than ecological and sustainability issues, which are quite important, unequal opportunities and access to resources often leading to social division of power. The empires, colonizers, have utilized our knowledge and power to subjugate, disjoin, disrupt African epistemologies, and therefore, if we are to think around sustainable development gain, we have to understand first, are we using Western lenses for analyzing, or are we using African contextualized analytics, knowledge systems, epistemologies to understanding ourselves and the solutions that we have to imagine? Are we apologetic around engaging with global knowledge systems and prioritizing the primacy of African knowledge systems? So the most important aspect is we must understand Africa's knowledge systems as we appreciate other global knowledge systems in the quest for solutions. Why must we reboot and reset? As I've already said, the monolithic approaches towards understanding sustainable development goals require multiplicities, alternatives, and also the primacy and prioritizing those who are on the underside, those who are wounded because of ecological and climatic changes, and those who are trampled upon because of their youth or undermined. And the question that we often do not ask: why are we talking about poverty and not talking about wealth? What is the place of greed, and do we have grid lines to ensure that the sustainable development goals are accomplished if 8 or 40 people in the world own 90% of the wealth, or at least 80% of the wealth? So while the current SDG provide valuable frameworks for development, there are key reasons why a reboot is necessary. And I want to draw on the words of the South American scholar and educationist Paulo Freire, who reminds us that critical consciousness is very important and a distinctive achievement of human life, because within critical consciousness, it allows us not to just take what is prescribed on us, but to ask the critical question that enables us to reimagining the future. And therefore, by so doing, our reimagination of the SDGs will enable us not to work on prescriptions, but to imagine alternative approaches. But also it's because for us as Africa, the tendency is to view us from the perspective of our mineral and biotic resources, but not necessarily from the decisions and aspirations that we want to undertake. If you look at the map, we're divided by the resources of our context and continent, and not necessarily from the intellectual resources around how such must be used. The other aspect is the stereotypical images of Africa that hollows Africa of its intellectual resources and therefore undermines its contributions, to the extent that Africa is defined as abandoned, hostile, bedeviled with HIV and AIDS, confronted with genocides, civil wars, soldiers, child soldiers, dictatorships, and yet the benefactors of such systems are often not called to question. Who bribes the bribed? Who corrupts the corruptees? Who undermines the development questions? These are some of the critical questions that I'd like to invite youth and young adults as they do their analysis around sustainable development goals and their assets or their resourcing of the human life would be about. So it's very important, therefore, that we don't just think around too many priorities, lack of clear mechanisms for implementation, reliability of funding instruments, the timelines of the goals that have been heavily affected by COVID-19 and the recent wars, which have limited the rebooting of the Sustainable Development Goals. But we must look into the solutions that will make the resetting and the rebooting important. One of the key instruments that I feel would be interested in making Sustainable Development Goals an important accomplishment is really investing in the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this instance, we've expected countries or societies to volunteer into these mechanisms, and it doesn't help in transforming and harnessing. The complicity of the relationship between the 17 SDGs present great challenges because pursuing one goal may inadvertently hinder progress in another. The perceived one-size-fits-all approach of the SDGs lack a robust focus on addressing systemic inequalities that I've already spoken about. The recalibration should prioritize more inclusive approaches that consider diverse socioeconomic, cultural, historical, knowledge context, and resources context. The global disparities may be unintentionally prolonged by the SDGs' universality due to overlooking the diverse socio and geopolitical context. And therefore, for us to succeed, we must look into where the priorities must be accelerated. The insufficient emphasis on addressing systemic issues such as corruption, political instability, the conflicts can impede progress towards the SDGs, necessitating the resolution of structural impediments for impactful sustainable development. When I started, I said we started with the Millennium Development Goals, we then came to Sustainable Development Goals, and now we are looking towards 2062 as the accomplishment. We'll be 30 or 32 years later to accomplishing what we want. Rebooting the SDGs should involve stronger emphasis on collaboration of universities, of societies, of global governance systems, of multilateral systems, and enhancing and overcoming the economic disparities that are increasingly attending to us. I can see Professor Peng is now worried. To transform, colleagues, is to mark change, is to not just in appearance, not just to alter greatly often the grotesque effects. It's not to think around dystopia, but it is really to compel the change in appearance, to mark change, to form nature or appearance, to change greatly, and to ensure that complete change in appearance becomes radiant, beautiful, life-affirming, and enabling for ecological justice, economic justice, and transformation and respect for humanity. Our late president, one of the freedom fighters in our world, has made an appeal that for us to ensuring that the Sustainable Development Goals or the goals of development are harnessed, it should be because we prioritize education, we value youthful dividend, we value the diversities of the knowledge systems, and we do not at all times allow Africa to be seen as the poor of the world for their multiple resources that the global arena requires, that require us to forming partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lenkabula. You have called for the wake-up call for having a critical consciousness as a critical tool for evaluating everything. It seems like Professor Lenkabula emphasized the pausing to reflect on the human journey toward a more sustainable society. She critically criticized current sustainable development goal in such a way as a fundamentally, somehow, can I say, modernist and colonial in nature, serving the perpetuating Western hegemony rather than addressing the specific need of the African nations or majority world. So she called for the reboot for the SDG and calling for inclusivity and receiving complexity, contextual specificity, collaboration in achieving sustainable goal globally. I thank you very much for your insightful thought and your wake-up call, the critical consciousness. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask His Excellency to deliver his messages. Thank you.
Dear Professor Pang, Director for Africa, Institute of Yonsei University, my dear sister, Professor Lenkabula, Vice Chancellor, University of South Africa, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. It's hard to speak after a professor, and if I had a choice, I think I could go first because she did so well, and maybe she has preempted a lot of that, what I'm going to say, but I'll try. So I thank you, Professor Pang, for having me on this panel and for your kind words of introduction. I'm delighted to see the Africa Institute of Yonsei University is taking shape, and I commend you for organizing this first ever side event, especially today, just a day after the official opening of the Institute. Once again, congratulations. I must confess that the session titled Calling for Transformation, a Critical Evaluation for the Majority World pumped up my adrenaline. It reminded me of my happy years of being a student, an activist, and a critic of international system and the world order. For that reason, allow me to unleash my activism today. Since the title itself, which says whose question, whose answers, is both radical and revolutionary. Ladies and gentlemen, we are far behind the target, so they say. Common phrase, we are far behind the target every now and then. Then they add, we risk of missing the target if we maintain the status quo. It's another sentence, common. Then they go on saying, there's a need to redouble our efforts to be able to close the existing gap. And so after that, we clap our hands. Common. These phrases offer nothing new. We heard them during the MDGs, and we are hearing them again now. I bet we shall hear more of this apologetic statement as we get closer to 2030. There's absolutely nothing much wrong with the SDG, as it were with the MDGs. These are lofty policy statements of intent, and they have done global good in pulling together efforts in the same direction. Many lives have been lifted and many progress made. Shortcomings notwithstanding, they at least help to mobilize collective conscience and uniformity of purpose. That itself is worthy of celebration. As I stand here today, we have already passed midway towards the destination 2030. Looking back to where we came from and looking forward to where we are heading, I have all the reasons to be cautious and less optimistic. I see the reinvention of narration in history. I hear the echo of many apologetic speeches, comments, and sound bites of regrets and disappointments. Also, I hear many vows and other empty promises to never again let this happen. We'll hear them as we go 2030. So when the MDGs were adopted in year 2000, I was in high school in my dear country, Tanzania. I was the chair of the Youth of United Nations Association of Tanzania, a youth-based advocacy organization that promotes the work of the United Nations at the grassroots with the aim of bringing the youth closer to UN and UN closer to the youth. I had a lot of hope and full of faith in international cooperation by then and the international community. So the 8 Millennium Development Goals did not just mean 8 rhetorical phrases for me then and my youth generation by then. They carried aspirations. They carried our hope. We saw in them the dawning of a new era in the new millennium. There was this euphoria of a new millennium. So it was like a new millennium, new way of doing things, dawning of a new era, Millennium Development Goals. We are going to solve problems that are surrounding us. We saw them as an end of empty promises and the beginning of a meaningful partnership between the North and the South, developed and the least developing, rich and poor. We thought we were closing a chapter and opening up a new one. Far from it. But one thing disturbed my mind whenever I looked at the 8 MDGs. It was not the goals, not the targets, but the order of the arrangement. The sequencing of the 8 goals did not make much sense to me. And I wondered whether it was accidental or rather intentional. I questioned the rationale of starting with goal 1, being eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, instead of goal 8, which was developing a global partnership for development. I saw starting with the goal 8 and going backward will give us a good test of our resolve and sincerity of our purpose. Today, looking back, I think I was closer to the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2015, when we were adopting the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, I was already a personal assistant and speechwriter to the President of the United Republic of Tanzania. Before joining the President, I worked in the Foreign Ministry and rose to become assistant to the Foreign Minister. I attended many UN General Assemblies meetings and side meetings leading up to 2015. In all these meetings, I started to notice the shift of gears and change of tone, as we are witnessing now. The loud and ambitious voice started to fade by the year 2010, and more apologetic and pragmatic voice emerged. The world started talking about meeting the bare minimum, focusing on the few goals to deliver more impact, voicing a sense of urgency and scapegoating on 2008 global financial crisis. Today, we have a new scapegoat, COVID-19. MDG's success was mixed, uneven, and patchy. Frankly speaking, we failed the world's poor, and we failed humanity. When SDG were adopted in 2015 with a high moral promise of leaving no one behind, I was little enthusiastic. Increased number of goals from 8 to 17 and targets from 21 to 169 got me more worried than contented. I questioned if we could not achieve 8 goals and 21 targets. What is the new magic formula that will make us achieve the 17 goals and 169 targets within the same time, 15 years? I quickly ran to check the orderly of the goals and I found the same story. Again, the financing of the SDG was placed on goal number 17, namely Partnership for Goals. I knew we were going to have the same script with the different tune in the near future, and here we are. Fast forward, today, we are meeting here and witnessing the same, empty promises and apologetic rhetorics. Report after report suggests that we were off target and risk not achieving the SDGs come 2030. The UNCTAD issue number 4, SDG Investment Trend Monitor, highlighted that the annual SDG investment gap in developing countries is now about $4 trillion US. It continued to reveal that if the SDG investment needs to 2030 are to be met, some $30 trillion US of additional investment must be found in the next 8 years. And that the current investment gap is 60% higher than a $2.5 trillion US estimated by UNCTAD in 2014 on the eve of the adoption of the SDG. It is therefore not surprising that today we are all alarmists about the fact that 2030 is near the corner and we are likely to again to miss the target. Some will pointing the blame to the design process of SDGs, and whether the process was adequately inclusive, some will scapegoat on the COVID-19 pandemic and later fuel and food crisis, which caused global inflation. Some will cliche about climate change and the disaster that followed. There will be numerous excuses, but all these, in my opinion, are not just new, just a repeated performance. Numbers never lie. We are not going to meet the 2030 target even before COVID-19, as evidenced by many reports, due to slow pacing in finance mobilization. Only 6 countries, namely Sweden, Norway, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Netherlands, have reached or exceed the 0.7% ODA commitment. Statistics also reveals that OECD average never exceeded 0.4%. While there seemed to be an increase of 15% of net ODA in the year 2021-2022, looking closely, according to the UN report, a big portion of it went to spend on refugees in donor countries and to Ukraine, not developing countries. Net bilateral ODA to Africa was just $34 billion by 2022, which is down by 7.4%. So it has been even going down prior to COVID. It is therefore nowhere near surprise that ODA disbursement to water sector decreased from $9.6 billion to $8.1 billion between 2015 and 2021. Situation is nowhere better when it comes to just energy transition to developing countries. During the same period, low and middle income countries' external debt also rose by 5.6% to $9 trillion, and statistics also revealed 37 out of 69 developing countries fell into debt distress by November 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, one may ask, are there no good news? The answer will be yes, there are good news and good progress. But measured against their ambition, these progress are not good enough and risk of being dwarfed by the magnitude of the compounding problem ahead. It is why today I dread away from self-pleasing, fragmented, and itsy-bitsy narratives. The OECD report titled Bottleneck to Access, SDG Finance and Developing Countries gives me no appetite to dwell on the niceties today. It called for the moment of truth and questioning our morality. It said, and I quote, developing countries need at least another $3.9 trillion to reach the SDGs. That is OECD estimate. And possibly $4.3 trillion according to UNCTAD. Nearly all of their resources, nearly all of their sources of financing have dropped, especially government revenues and FDI. How they can play their part in the global fight against climate change and its consequences, which necessitate mobilizing an additional estimated $1 trillion in external finance by 2030, the report posed that question to us. So in the interest of time, allow me to pinpoint just on the SDGs whose realization is of urgency and crucial importance to developing countries. That is SDG 13, which relates to climate change. There is wide consensus that developing countries are the hardest hit by the climate change, even though they least contributed to it. Logic will demand that those responsible will be guilty enough and handsomely compensate the victims. Alas, it is not the case. In year 2009, developed countries committed to mobilize around $100 billion by year 2020. The target was not met by 2020. As of now, it is around $83.3 billion according to OECD. Mind you, that $100 billion is not even meeting the actual demand of the developing countries, which, according to UN FCC, it's about $6 trillion will be needed by 2030 to meet the just half of the existing national determined contribution of developing countries. What is disappointing is that less and less money is channeled to adaptation. We need money for mitigation and adaptation, but less and less money is channeled to adaptation. And even that small amount of money committed to funds like GCF and GEF is subjected to bureaucratic, cumbersome, and very frustrating processes that systematically excludes governments, NGOs, and private sector from developing countries in favor of NGOs, multilateral organizations, and private sector from the north to implement mitigation and adaptation programs and projects in the global south. Even that small amount of money that goes to GCF and GEF, you have European NGOs, Western NGOs, Northern NGOs going to take that money to implement programs to Africa and not allowing Africans to do it themselves. Nevertheless, Tanzania never tires to try doing something about our situation within the limits that exist. My president, Her Excellency Samia Suluhu Hassan, the only African woman executive president, decided to take leadership to champion the African Women Clean Cooking Support Program. She launched this initiative during the COP28 in Dubai. While we worry much about critical minerals for EV batteries and hydrogen energy to power engines, about 300,000 women and 300,000 children are said to die every year in developing countries due to respiratory diseases. Quoting the president of African Development Bank, he said, "The risk of women dying from a lack of cooking oil solution is 3 times higher than the risk of dying from malaria." Addressing clean cooking energy in developing countries and in Africa in particular is a good economics. According to the World Bank, residential fuel burning accounts up to 58% of global black carbon emissions and a gigaton of carbon dioxide per year, approximately 2% of the global emissions. Also, according to ADB, Africa requires just $4 billion annually in investment to provide clean cooking equipment to 250 million women by 2030. My question is this really too much to ask? But starting with Tanzania, President Samia commits to achieve 70% clean cooking energy by 2030. Currently, 80% of cooking energy used in Tanzania is charcoal and firewood. As a result, we are losing about 1% of our forest annually, equivalent to 400,000 hectares of forest. These kind of initiatives, unfortunately, are less popular, less amplified, and less funded. The world climate change energy transition debate has been reduced to EV batteries, critical minerals, and hydrogen energy. What about the poor? That's a very question that my sister raised here about the context and questions. Certainly, we can do something about it before it's too late. All is not lost. What we need to be done is to honestly interrogate our resolve and honor our commitments. Let us do the first things first. Let us sort the goal 17. Let us fix the financing problem first, and the rest shall fall in place. Let's not waste time in questioning the origin of SDGs. It's too late for me. How inclusive was the process to arrive to them? Too late to me. Or whether they are comprehensive or not, too late to me as well. Let us put money behind the goals, and let us implement them as they are in the latent spirit with sweet transformation. Let us just go that way. Just implement them faithfully, despite of their own shortcomings, and we see transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, when MDGs were adopted, I was 20 years old. By 2030, which is the SDG target, I will be 50 years old. That will be 30 years span. And literally, that is 1 generation. So if we fail, or if we do not achieve, that will be a 1 generation condemned. That will be 1 generation wasted. That will be a generation-old hypocrisy. Something must be done and should be done now. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Wow. What a thought-provoking speech you delivered. I mean, drawing on his personal experience and observation in his youth as a revolutionary, spirit-filled young man, then you're still looking very young. Ambassador expressed a skepticism about the progress toward achieving the sustainable goal by 2030. He truly reflects on the shortcomings of the both Millennial Development Goal MDGs and the SDGs, noting a lack of significant progress despite so lofty aspiration. There is lack of significant progress is done. The ambassador criticized the order of the goal, questioning why the financing is placed last rather than first. He lays bare the shortfalls in funding for SDG, and for the water, energy, and so forth. But however, as he's not a pessimist, he's an optimist in some way. Despite some progress, Ambassador calls for concrete effort to honor commitment and to implement the goal effectively to avoid condemning future generation to come. I think you have provided us, really, both of you provided us a critical consciousness to look at the gauge the world critically. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to open a question. Before I open the question to the floor, I do have a couple of questions for our brother and sister here. I mean, both of you mentioned that how do you argue that SDG perpetuate kind of Western colonial agenda, particularly in relation to Africa? How do you say? It seems like there is some sentiment, there is some implication of it. So maybe from Professor, can you comment on that?
I doubt that, thank you very much, Professor Pang. I want to think about the logic of SDGs requiring universal solutions as though the experience are similar. That for me is akin to Western logics of imagining ideas within universal framework without taking into cognizance the contextual realities that frame analytical frameworks. So that's the first logic that I see. The second logic that I see, which I think creates the primacy for Western thought system, not even Korean thought system, not even African thought system, is the fact that it also creates hierarchies and disjointed approach. You would know in any scholarly or engagement or any knowledge system, there's no linear approach. There are multidisciplinary, multifocal, and multi-lenses to solutions that have to be attended to. And I think this idea of compartmentalizing the problems, the solutions, is one idea that is quite separate from how we think, how we analyze, and how we imagine solutions. And therefore, I think that's one of the limitations. I want to believe that whereas the Millennium Development Goals were generally top-down, I do appreciate that the Sustainable Development Goals were consulted heavily amongst communities, civil society, business sector, and others, and were agreed to. However, it is still very clear that as even earlier on, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon was saying, the Western hegemony or its lenses would have seen in the approaches and the prioritization of the development aspects. And the final aspect is that Ambassador Mavura has already spoken to the prioritization, or at least how to give primacy or shape to the Sustainable Development Goals. The actual weakness of the development goals is that we've put ideation without the practice or the praxis that should enable articulation of that ideation. And in our world system, we don't just put ideas and theorization. We also look at the plans, the implementation processes, and the financing solutions that have to undergird the developmental trajectory that have to be taken. And that's why I said that is a compartmentalized Western world system that I don't think is helpful if you are to solve the global questions that we need to through the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, your thought on this?
Thank you. My sister has answered that very well, and I'll pick from there. Goals as they are look so noble if you look at them, but the underlying architecture is something that we need to question. We are where we are somehow because we have been failed by the liberal world order. The international cooperation, international architecture is built in the image of the liberal order, which has failed to deliver to the good public global goods to many people in the world. So prior to even MDGs, there was a debate about reforming of the United Nations, reforming of the Bretton Woods extension system, reforming of the whole international architecture. Sometime in 1970s, 80s, G77 went there to try to bring a new international economic order, because we say something is wrong with the structure. So it doesn't matter much how good goals can be crafted, so long as the structure itself is problemsome. So this is what we are seeing. So eventually we end up devising SDGs, fine, they're good, they're very lofty, but we are depending on the same architecture to implement it. So we're expecting World Bank, we're expecting IMF, we're expecting all these structures to implement the same goals. That's where we now have a problem that I was trying to say. Then you have the same organizations like UNDP, UNEP going to GCF looking for money to implement programs in Africa. I mean, so what's the point of it? But look at like a Marshall Plan, which was given to Europe. You could see there were goals and there was money into it. The Marshall Plan turned Europe from devastating to where it is today. I mean, why can something like that be done to the developing world? Simple question. Thank you.
And during our conversation and talk, it seems like I have witnessed or I have sensed some of the challenges highlighted regarding the ineffectiveness of SDG and how do they hinder progress toward really sustainable development. Maybe the ambassador could go first at this time.
Ineffectiveness of SDGs. I won't depart much. I think today I'll be dedicating on financing. That's the only thing today I'm speaking. It's nothing else, because the rest is English to me. Right? If we have goals and targets, then we need money into it. We need to put money into it. That's the only thing. Leaving these goals to countries who are already economically stressful, debt distress, climate change affected. I mean, how do you expect these goals to be effectively implemented? Simple and clear. To me, we have to solve the first things first. I know by 2030 we'll come with another name, maybe Super Sustainable Development Goals, SDG. But I think in the next one, we need to start talking about financing first. To me, that's where the ineffectiveness comes. It's not lack of intention from developing countries. It's not like that. All our countries, you could see the Agenda 2063, which my sisters presented here. If you go to all African countries, governments are struggling to deliver to these goals, but the means are very limited.
Oh, thank you. Professor?
I just want to make an example of some of the complexities and contradictions of the Sustainable Development Goals. For instance, we aspire in the Sustainable Development Goal for peace, justice, and strong institutions. Ambassador has already just talked about the multilateral systems that is hierarchical. That doesn't allow, for instance, Korea and South Africa, if I were to give an example, or even Tanzania, to have a strong space in the sun. So in the United Nations, you have 5 countries that are just able to veto any contribution. So how is that a peaceful, just, and strong institutional multilateral system? For instance, in the current context, we've been dealing with the Ukraine and Russia war. It has been persisting for a very long time, despite the existence of the aspirations of the SDGs for these strong institutions that could quell the violence in the world, the wars, the battles. The same is true to gender equality, which is, and when I started, I did say I'm a feminist. I am happy to affirm the sacred beauty of men and women and their talents as important imperative. But if we look at the articulation of sustainable development goals and education, for instance, as a resource, the investments on eradicating and ensuring gender equality are oftentimes not attended to. Earlier on, just before this session, we're talking about what work is valued and paid for or remunerated, and what work is not valued when we're discussing the care economy. So these are some of the aspects that project the contradictions of the Sustainable Development Goals, which require you and me, Professor Peng, as leaders within the higher education system or university system, to then looking at how do we rethink curriculum? What resources do we provide for our students, but also people like him who are diplomats, who negotiate the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that the policy system are attentive and responsive and ensure that the programs, the implementation, the financing, the accountability systems are supported. And for me, as we had said, we know who are the countries that consume the resources of the earth more than the others, but we cannot hold them accountable. That's the failure of institutions and the architecture of multilateralism that we have to think about. And the final thing, I think the gender one was quite nice for me, for Korea and South Africa, because these are questions that our countries have to debate, contest, and think about, especially because patriarchal cultures tend to be a little bit strong and sometimes undermine the full vitality of women's contributions, and therefore we have to hold hands and accompany each other in ensuring that women and men become active participants. Thank you. The last part, Ambassador made an example. We talk about EVs and EVAs, and we forget that we go to DRC Congo for majority of these resources. And we talk about them as energy efficient. They're not. They wound the earth. They hollow communities and societies. But because they're not located in the global north, they become just fodder for abuse. And to liberate the SDGs, we must also question and require accountabilities on the implementation processes or the interventions therein required. Thank you.
Yeah, I know DR Congo has 70% of cobalt, which is absolutely necessary ingredient for the EV and others. It's amazing. I'm going to take one question from floor. Okay. We can't hear you, so somebody will bring the microphone.
Thank you so much. So in the context of contextualization of the SDGs, or sort of whatever the goals that come up in the future, how do you see them implemented in the international space? So are they going to be country by country to allow sort of for full agency to be held by the regions in question? Or are there still going to be some sort of international agreements or international level policies that regulate like the future development of the SDGs, or again, whatever regulation that comes after that?
Ambassador, maybe you go first. Maybe this is very diplomatic matters.
Thank you so much. One thing member states, especially us from the South, will never stop doing is going to the table. We'll always come to the table, we'll always come to make our case with a belief that one day it will be heard, that one day will make sense. It's just a matter of time. This is a generational and it's quite of a relay kind of war. So yes, 2030 will come, but probably this will not be implemented. We'll go back to negotiate. But I think my generation will negotiate differently. Between now and 2030, when we talk about rebooting, I think rebooting, restating is all about also demanding these goals to be part of the comprehensive international system reform. If we're going to have any other set of goals with the same architecture that we're having today, it's going to be a non-starter. So I think the next time is to see how can we make more accountable system. My sister was talking about accountable system. It's not a question of countries committing, because it's simple. Leading from the MDGs and SDGs means you can commit and you can get away with it, and then just give excuses later in the future, say like COVID came, all these calamities will always be there. Financial crisis, climate change, and I don't know what next will come. Wars will always be there. But there should be a kind of accountability for those who make commitments that they should be delivering. I think that's the way to go. So if there's something that we are learning in a hard way is if we are not reforming the international system architecture, and then there's no amount of goals, no amount of indicators will make any difference. I think that will be a starting point. It should come together with reforms of United Nations and all these other institutions.
Last?
I think we shouldn't be skeptical about the imperative for having multilateral systems or international systems. We should actually encourage them, because it is through them that we can harness the validity and feasibility of the Sustainable Development Goals. What we are saying is that precisely because of the asymmetrical power systems within the multilateral systems, we should agitate for an equilibrium that is attentive to the challenges that societies go through, that planetary Earth go through, and that are attentive not to one narrative or one hegemony. So an African feminist scholar, Chimamanda Ngozi, talks about avoiding the single narrative. And the Sustainable Development Goals must be around listening deeply to the multiplicities of complexities and challenges, but also to the varied knowledge arenas, to the solutions that are proposed. And we have hope that if such were to be attended to, and the financing mechanisms were not spent in the global north when they are supposed to be spent everywhere else, then this would be meaningful. And therefore, what's important is fair, accountable, responsible articulation of multilateral agreements. Thank you.
That's very important. There is no master narrative that can solve all the problems. It's a very philosophical shift of thought. Thank you very much. We have come to the conclusion, and we have come to realize that the SDG, while the noble in its intent, but falls short of the complex reality and systemic inequality faced by the majority world. By fostering inclusivity, addressing systemic issues such as corruption and political instability, and others for innovation and progress, I think we can chart a path toward a more just, sustainable, and resilient future for all. As we embark on the journey together, and even this university, for transformation, let us remain committed to working together, learning from the past lessons and continuously questioning and re-evaluating our approach to development. Only through that collective effort, the genuine collaboration, and a steady, fast commitment to the equity and the justice can we truly realize the vision of the sustainable development for all global citizens, ensuring a more radiant, beautiful, and just world for generations to come. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Professor and Ambassador. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, dear panelists. This was indeed a very critical analysis of the SDGs and a very different interpretation of rebooting the Agenda 2030. I believe it leaves us with some homework to do on how we can realistically achieve a better future for all.
Thank you for joining us today on the first day of the 2024 Global Engagement and Empower Forum held here at Yonsei University. This marks the end of the first day, and we will return with more exciting talks here at the Centennial Hall and at the Baekgyangnuri Grand Ballrooms 1 and 2 tomorrow on day 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you.